Hi folks. So I've been thinking about the right way to do this next part and ended up recording a video that was just way too long and covered too many things. So I've decided to instead split it up into smaller parts and focus on one aspect at a time. So this video is just going to be a brief overview of the building system. We're going to look at the basics of set decoration and then do the other stuff in the next video. So let's get started. One of the things that makes the tool set so versatile is the variation of pre-built terrain blocks coupled with object placeables. There's a large number of object placeables we can mix and match to make our scene feel detailed and realistic. To build our goblin camp quickly, we can go over the location with the appropriate terrain edits before diving in and adding placeables for detail. So let's first head over to some bit of the map that's far enough away from our quest giver in order to seem relevant. So it's a little bit of a journey for our player. If you've gone for the same map size as I have, you'll see there's not quite that much room to play with, but this is fine for our purposes since we're only doing a little demo level. I'm going to pick a fairly open zone in this corner, but obviously feel free to make your camp as large or as small as you like, depending on your own preferences and map size. So for set decoration, there are two primary tools that we can use. That's the terrain palette, which we've already seen in the very first video, and the placeables palette, which we're going to go over today. Now, it's a good idea to always do your terrain edits first, because these are harder to change around later on. We've already done some terrain editing, as I said in the very first video, but today we're going to look at features and groups. These are large static map features which completely take up the tile in which they are spawned. Features will take up one tile each, and groups are larger features that will take up multiple tiles. So firstly, we're going to set down some static features. These will be the biggest components of your goblin camp. So let's go over to our paint terrain tab and head over to the features menu. I'm going to use the ones marked Warzone 1 and Warzone 2 for this, as I think they fit the general theme of the camp. Obviously, in your own camp, feel free to play about with all the other ones as well. So once you've selected a feature to place, remember you can right click to rotate the preview and then left click to place it when you're finished. One other thing to note before we continue is that the random terrain here is a little bit rocky, as you can see. We can edit this by moving over to our terrain tab and selecting grass, then clicking here in the middle until we get 4 tiles with all the features gone. So you might have a little bug here where the shadows from the deleted features are still there, but they should disappear as well once we build our game, so we can ignore that for now. If you want to make your camp a little bit bigger, you can also check out the Groups tab. Groups, as I said, they work in the exact same way as features, except that they're spread across multiple tiles, and they will show you the actual number of tiles they take up when you hover over them. So the Warzone 1x2 group fits thematically with what I've already put down. For me, it's a little bit big, so I'm going to skip that for now. Obviously, feel free to include that yourself if you feel like it. So we've outlined part of the boundary of our camp, so now we can add a little bit of detail. We can do this by using placeables. Placeables differ from features and groups in that they are actual objects in the world. They're independent of the tiling system, so they don't clip to the tiles, and they can be placed in specific positions. They are also objects, so they can interact in all the way objects can. So, for example, we can use scripts to directly change their behavior. Depending on which version of the base game you have installed, you might have access to slightly different placeables here. So I'll explain the basics and then I will let you design the camp yourself to your liking. Because placeables are objects, they act a lot more like NPCs in the editor than like features. So, for example, you can rotate them, you can scale them, you can assign scripts, you can create locks for doors and containers, and so on. I'm going to finish off building the perimeter of this camp with some wooden spikes. So let's navigate over to the Placeables tab on the right and take a quick look through the menus. So there are a few subheadings, and the existing placeables are sorted in a fairly logical way. I'm going to grab the Cheval de Frise from the military tab and spawn one in to just begin building out the perimeter of our camp. A quick reminder on the basic controls for these. So you can move objects by left clicking and dragging. You can rotate by holding down Shift and the right mouse button. You can also use Control C to copy and Control V to paste. So let's spawn in a few copies of these around the area, and then once they're all placed, we can rotate and move them around to make a rough kind of circle border around the area here. Okay, so now we should have a rough outline of the camp, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to add a couple of other features. You can spend more time if you'd like to make your camp feel a little bit more exciting than mine. For me, I'm just going to grab one of the campfires from the miscellaneous section and place it somewhere in the middle of the camp here. Finally, I'm going to grab the scorch mark placeable from the battlefield section, and I'm just going to place it under the fire. This will make it seem a little bit more realistic. The ground is charred and burned at the location where the fire is. Now, as I place this down, you might notice an issue here. The scorch mark seems a little bit too small for the size of the campfire. So let's take this as a quick opportunity to go over object properties. So we can select our scorch mark, right click it, and go over to the properties menu. You will see that our placeable is currently marked as static. Most placeables that you spawn in the world will have this tag. It does affect a few things, but the main thing for us is the behavior of the object. Static objects aren't expected to change once they're loaded in. They're essentially part of the background of the scene. Objects that we want to be able to interact with, for example, doors, chests, traps, etc., should not be static, as they will change during gameplay. For example, our spike fences and our campfire are both static because the player is unable to move them or destroy them, and they have no real purpose other than blocking the path and decorating the scene. Unticking the static box gives us a few more options for what we can do with this object. Firstly, we could select the usable and has inventory checkboxes. Usable objects will be marked as interactable on the player's screen, so they will see a use action when hovering over them. We could then define the functionality of the object using scripts. Has inventory objects are very useful for things like containers, as they allow us to specify the exact inventory of an object. We will take a look at both of these options in the next video when we are designing a container. For now, on this, we just want to get rid of the static modifier on the suit spot because it will allow us to do one other thing. We will be able to scale the placeable to our needs. As a disclaimer, I think this particular feature, the scaling, is only a feature of the enhanced edition of the toolset. So if you have the older version of the game, this might not work for you. Don't worry if it doesn't. Obviously, this is just a little aesthetic improvement. So to scale the non-static placeable, we can hold down the control key and use your mouse wheel to zoom in and out to increase or decrease the size. So here we can make this little soot spot just a little bit bigger. So that is basically the beginnings of our camp. If you'd like to spend more time on the decoration of it, I would recommend that you check out the Parks and Nature section. And that in particular has some cool trees and bushes, which you can sort of put around the camp and make it feel a little bit more alive and foresty. So to finish the decorating here, I'm going to add one other thing, and that is going to be some ambient sounds. So let's jump over to the sound palette. You'll see again the sounds are sorted under thematic subheadings. We're going to add a couple of sounds to make the camp a little bit more lively. Again, feel free to look over the available sounds later on by yourself and add more to your camp if you feel they need it. For now, we just want to understand a little bit about how sounds work. So firstly, let's grab the fire smolder sound from the nature menu and add that right on top of our campfire. Placing sounds works in the same way as placing placeables. So we're just going to select it and left click to drop it on top of our fire. You should see this small light blue orb or half orb. And if you zoom out far enough, you should also be able to see a larger orb surrounding that. So if we right click on our sound and go to properties, we can figure out what it's trying to do. In the basic tab, we see the basic object properties. The thing to pay attention to here is the list of actual sound files included in the sound object. Sound objects can have one or many sound files. For example, if you were building out a tavern interior sound, you might have several conversation files here, the sounds of dishes rattling, the floor being scrubbed, drinks being poured, all in one big sound file. So these individual files could then be played together or randomly, and that would create a rich sound experience from several basic files. Here we just have the one sound file, and that's the fire crackling. We can use the play stop button to listen to it, but there's not much else interesting here. So let's move on to the positioning tab. Just a quick clarification before we continue. I'm going to be referring to the player now when explaining volume distances. So these sound calculations are actually based around the location of the player's camera, not the player's character. So just keep in mind when I talk about the location of the player in this bit, it's actually the location of the player's camera that matters. So volume distances is the thing that we actually want to look at quite closely here. The two blue orbs that you saw earlier around your sound are these values here. This is how you control how far the sound travels. The cutoff distance is the larger blue orb on your map. So if the player is outside of this range, you won't be able to hear the sound at all. And the max volume distance is automatically set to be 10 times smaller than the cutoff distance. And that's the little blue orb on your map. So if the player is standing within that little blue orb, you will be able to hear the sound at its maximum volume. A player standing anywhere between these two distances, so outside of the little orb but inside the big orb, will hear the sound with a diminished volume based on how far away they are from the center of the sound. So the default values are actually fine for this, I think. The 10-meter cutoff isn't super intrusive, and the 1 meter max volume distance seems good for when you're standing right next to the fire. The only thing I would adjust is the height. We want the root of the sound coming from the very base of the fire. So I'm going to set this to 0, 0. Now that the fire is done, we'll look at the other tab in a moment when we place our next sound. I imagine the goblins are generally quite nasty and unhygienic creatures, and they will attract all sorts of parasites and insects. So we're going to add another slightly different sound to the place. This time we'll head over to the Animals tab and grab our fly sound. That's the singular fly, not fly's loop, although feel free to add fly's loop later on if you like. So we can stick this right in the middle of the camp next to our existing fire sound. We'll see that it's got the same kind of deal as the campfire sound with our orb ranges, but it also has this little square around it. So let's go over to properties for this sound and take a look at what it does. So we can navigate straight to the positioning tab for this, and we see that the option is now selected to play from a random position every time. Our campfire was, by contrast, played from a specific position. So we can do this because the fly is a discrete sound. Unlike our campfire, which is playing constantly on a loop, the fly sound will play once, then it's going to wait a bit, and then it will play again. What's useful here is specifying the random range, and that's the width and height of the square on the ground, from which the origin of the sound happens. Every time this sound plays, the origin will be at a different location within this square. Again, I think 10 by 10 is a good size. You can obviously stretch that out yourself or narrow it down to fit the size of your own goblin camp. I think mine pretty much perfectly overlaps with the size of the camp here. So we're also going to assume that the flies can be anywhere in the camp. So let's make sure that the random square does cover most of it. Lastly, let's have a look at the advanced tab. There are a lot of very specific controls here, and I will just very briefly go over these and what you might use them for. So when to play, it gives you very granular time controls for the sound. So you can even specify specific in-game times. So maybe if you have something like a marketplace in one of your towns and it's really busy during the day, but you've got a script for all the NPCs to go home at night, you don't want to play the busy market sounds during the nighttime. So you would use this to specify to only play during certain hours, for example. Playstyle is fairly simple. Here we're using repeating, meaning it plays a sound, takes a break, and then plays the sound again. The campfire was seamlessly looping, which means it's playing the sound continuously. Once it gets to the end of that sound file, it just picks it up instantly from the start. So it will just continue doing that. I don't know why you would use once. If I wanted to play something once, I'd probably just write a script for that rather than placing an object down, but you might have an idea for why you would want to use that. So play order, if we have multiple sound files in the basic tab, this controls the order that they're played in. Here we just have one sound file as we did with the campfire, so it doesn't really matter what the play order is. And then we have some sliders to determine randomness. This is good because it makes it sound much more realistic. You can see that realism is a big thing, kind of theme that I'm going for in this video. So here we have the base interval first, which means we're playing roughly every 25 seconds. Interval variation is then applied to that base interval. So here it's 5, which means the sound will actually play every 20 to 30 seconds. So 25 plus minus 5. Volume variation, we're going to keep it 0. We want it to be the same volume all the time. Obviously, if you want it a little bit quieter, sometimes a little bit louder, you can set this. And then pitch variation just mixes your sound up a little bit by changing the pitch so it doesn't sound like the exact same fly. Sometimes it'll have a slightly deeper tone and sometimes it'll have a slightly more high-pitched tone. So these are all good defaults, except that I'm going to drop the base interval all the way down to 10 seconds, so that we should get that fly sound from somewhere within that square, roughly every 5 to 15 seconds. This shouldn't get too annoying because of the random positioning, Sometimes it'll spawn right next to the player, sometimes it'll be on the other side of the camp, so they can only hear it very faintly. Right, and that is the sounds done. Again, feel free to add more. This is just the basics to show you how they work. As always, test, save, let's have a look at the changes that you've made to the map. Now, as I mentioned, I originally filmed this as one super lengthy video. I didn't like the way it came out, so I'm going to wrap this one up here and do a separate follow-up where we will be creating our own custom placeables and some items to put in them. So until next time, thank you for watching and I'll see you again soon.